Hello, my name is Eva, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of The Charm of It, a podcast for knitters who share my fascination with the nitty-gritty details of our craft. If you're a returning viewer, it's so nice to see you again. And if you're a new viewer, I'm glad that you have found your way to my little corner of the internet. You can expect a lot of projects out of cool, muted colors, and that include embellishments or details. This is going to be a regular episode, and that means I talk about finished objects and include various other segments. My other episodes are only about works in progress. I skipped last week, but hopefully I'll do one next week. Anyway, I do have quite a few finished objects to discuss, and so I suspect that that is not going to leave time for many other things. However, I will be revisiting a discussion about button bands that I started earlier, and then I will also be reading to you from a book where there's a paragraph about handcrafts. So, yep, it should be a pretty fun episode, and I'm excited to share with you all the things that I've been making. First up is more gift knitting. I showed you the Sailing the Seas baby dress that I knit last episode, and I decided to go ahead and make it a layout set. So I made these adorable Mary Jane booties. With these, I had two of these little flower buttons in my stash. So I thought about putting one on the dress, but then I thought it would be nicer to use the two for the booties. And here's how they look as shoes. Aren't they so cute? And there are two of them. And I followed a free pattern on Ravelry. Can't remember the name, but you can see it on the project page. Oh, and I'll mention that a little later. Anyway, and I'm not sure I would recommend the pattern. I think that it turned out really lovely, but I definitely had to kind of guess what I was doing in a couple spots. So if you're a beginner knitter, then you will probably not like this. But as long as you have some experience and can kind of fudge things and don't mind seaming, these are knit flat, then I think it has a really cute result. However, it does say that they're newborn size, and they definitely turned out bigger than newborn. I wanted mine to be bigger than newborn, but I'm just saying. And they've been washed and dried, and so they've shrunk a little. They were even bigger when I finished knitting them. But I really love the texture mix of the garter stitch with this kind of brioche fisherman's rib, and I think it will go very nicely with the dress. So I am pleased with them. And then I also made a bonnet. And it turns out bonnets are really difficult to try to model, but here it is flat. And then, okay, you see what I mean? Here's how it's going to be on the baby, but that will be much cuter when it has a baby face instead of my hand. And then here's the back, which I'm really pleased with how this turned out. So I wanted a bonnet that would match the dress. Let me show you the dress again. So here's the dress. This is the Clara pattern. And on my project page, there's a link to the Ravelry user who has a free English copy in public domain. A few people have asked me about that. So that's the copy that I used. And as you can see, it has this really pretty lace pattern down here and then a really beautiful leaf yoke. So I copied that for the bonnet. Ooh, here they are together, sort of. And I used the same seed stitch edging that the dress has. I wanted it to be a set. And here it is next to the little baby booties. Oh, can we get them on? I'm excited. I think it's going to be really cute. So what I did was I found a base pattern for the bonnet, and the one that I used is the dough cap, which is not available as a Ravelry download. It's in the Making Magazine Volume 2, the Fauna one, and I was kindly gifted a copy of that. So I had it on my shelves, and the pattern is just a plain stockinette bonnet with a rib band, and then it's got two little deer ears that you attach. That's what the dough cap is, D-O-E. And I thought that was really cute, but what I really liked about it was the shape. When I looked at other bonnet patterns on Ravelry, they seemed like they hung down a little more in the front, and I liked that this one was very snug. And it came in quite a few sizes. So I used that pattern for my stitch counts, and then I did go down in stitch count for this edging because seed stitch isn't going to draw in the way that ribbing did. But after that, I followed the directions for the shaping and stuff of that pattern, and all I did was add these lace patterns up to the top. So you knit straight to here, and then when I started the crown decreases, these leaves, the vein is made by decreases, right? That's how lace works. So you can see up here, there's veins. There we go. So those are decreases. And so when I got to the crown shaping, I looked at it and I realized that I could fit the crown shaping into another leaf pattern just by kind of fiddling with things a bit, so that's what I did. And so yeah, there's leaves all the way around. This is a purl column, in case you're wondering. That's not like random super laddered stitches or anything. In retrospect, I shouldn't have left that purl column in, but whatever. It'll still look really cute. I did not take notes while I was doing that, so I don't have useful notes on my project page. Sorry about that. It's one of those things where I just did it while I was knitting it, and so I wouldn't be able to recreate it. But the numbers fit out really well, and I did note what size I knit the bonnet in on my project page, so in case you want to do something similar. As long as you've knit a few hats before, it becomes pretty obvious how crown shaping works, so then it's easier to fit into a lace pattern. So yeah, so this is the Sailing the Seas bonnet, and booties! These are so cute. I have no idea if they'll actually stay on, but the idea is just too cute to not do. And the buttons are functional. Woo. Oh, and then other than adding all of that patterning to the bonnet, the only other major change I did was the pattern has you do I-cord ties and then an I-cord edging around the opening. I just used a crochet hook and held the yarn double and did crochet chains for this and singles for the edging, because that seemed like it would be much more efficient than I-cord. I'm not a big fan of knitting I-cord. I love the effect, so I will do it, but in a context like this where a crochet chain would be just as good, I'm always going to choose the crochet chain. The yarn is Rowan Summerlight 4-ply, which is 100% cotton, and it's in the aqua colorway. I am disappointed in this yarn. I was not disappointed while I was knitting it. Uh-oh, are we going to have focusing issues? I hope not. But then I machine washed it. So for the record, the ball band says that you should hand wash and dry flat. So perhaps if I had done that, then I would not be disappointed in the yarn, but I don't see the point of knitting with cotton if you can't at least put it in the washer, if not the dryer. Oh, I have to start a new segment. As I was saying, I knew that I was going to block this as machine wash at least, and so I washed it on cold with a load of my own laundry. It was on a delicate cycle. And then originally I was planning to dry it flat. However, at some point my friend is going to put this in the dryer. That's just, going to happen. And so I didn't want something terrible to happen to the dress after she put it in the dryer and then have her feel bad. So I decided that I would just put it in the dryer, and that way if it was going to change size or anything, it would change size at the beginning and she would receive it and it would be fine. So I dried it on the lowest heat setting, delicates, which is still hot. And it did shrink up. It lost somewhere around 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of this skirt length. So that was a little sad, hopefully, because I had knit it longer than the pattern suggested so that she would get more wear out of it. And so hopefully it'll still be a long enough length to be useful. And it doesn't seem like the yoke changed size. Like, that still seems like it'll be comfortable. And it didn't really change in width very much. It was just the length that shrunk up. Anyway, and I washed them all at the same time and dried them. So what disappointed me, it wasn't the shrinkage so much, because I think that that's a fair expectation with cotton. It was the way that the texture changed. When I was knitting this, it was very slinky and lustrous, and after one trip through a washer and dryer, it has no slink left, and it just kind of, it doesn't look fresh and new anymore. So I found that unimpressive. My stitches did even out, which is why I wanted to block it. And I still think it's a really cute dress, and she'll get a lot of wear out of it, and I'm glad that I knit it in cotton, and it's softer and cuddlier now than it was before. But what I suspect is that they had put some kind of treatment on the yarn to make it slinkier, and then that treatment came off via laundering. So based on that experience, I would not use this yarn again, because that's just not something I want in gift knitting, is for the gifts to suddenly look worn after they've been washed and dried once. But that's okay. I'm still really excited about the layette. I just thought that I would mention that. I think if I were going to knit a baby dress for someone again, I would knit it out of Quince & Company's 100% organic linen yarn, Sparrow, which is what this cardigan is, because that stays drapey and it just softens and becomes even better after every wash and dry. And I always machine dry these cardigans because I like the effect it has. So, yeah. I'm still really pleased with how that set came together and how the bonnet worked out, so I'm sure that my friend will really enjoy it. Let's see, I think next up, it's hard to remember what I finished next, was I finished my Rosemary Andrew stole, and this turned out very large indeed. I will insert a photo of me wearing it because I don't think you're going to be able to see it all. So this is it folded over in half. And here it is. And I will show you the way that I have been wearing it because I really love how it works. I love gigantic shawls like these. Okay, so I put the loop on one side, and then to make sure the right side is showing, I pull the bottom one through, then I twist the loop and pull the top one through. When I posted this on Instagram, a couple people had asked, so I thought I would demonstrate in case you had not seen that knot tie before. And then I just fluff it up. And yeah, you're not going to be able to see it all. I will insert the photo. I got a compliment on this the first time I wore it out and about to the grocery store, which was pretty exciting. So, focus. You've seen this before. It is the understoried wrap pattern, which was designed by Erin, whose last name I can never remember. I'm so bad with names. But it is a paid-for pattern on Ravelry, and she was giving away a copy because I'm friends with her. I bought my copy, but she kindly offered a copy to a giveaway, and I've closed that thread and drawn the winner, and it is Better in Popcorn, who is Deborah. So congrats, Deborah. Erin will be in touch with a copy of the pattern. And for the rest of you, I highly recommend this pattern. It was very adaptable to different sizes. The only modification I made was to knit it one repeat more narrow, because I had a bit less yarn than the stole called for. And there's these really wonderful transitions between the different lace charts that I love. So you get to switch between doing two different kinds of lace, which makes it feel as if it's less of just, you know, a rectangle that you're knitting over and over again. And then I just loved the way that she worked out these transitions. They're probably my favorite part. Let's take it off so I can show you one of the other. So there's the other place it transitioned. And it's knit on the bias, which means that the charts have old leaves, you know, being decreased out of existence and new leaves being formed. And all of that is done in a very organic way too. So she put a lot of thought and design into the pattern, and it just has a really beautiful finished object, and it's very easy to read and follow the pattern. So what do I need to talk about? Probably the yarn. I don't think I should take a week off between podcasting. I appear to get too spacey. So this is Barrett Yarn Woolen Spun Fingering, which is a Merino Corriedale blend. And I actually borrowed the Knitter's Book of Wool from my library so I could tell you guys about Corriedale sheep, because that is a new breed for me. While I am bringing it up, because of course I did not plan ahead, I will tell you that it's spun and dyed in a mill in Wisconsin from American Sheep, and it was $18 a skein, and the skeins, they're supposed to be 100 grams with 450 yards. However, when I finished the stole, I had 30 grams of yarn left over, but the stole itself weighs about 200 grams. So I think the skeins were actually 4 ounces, which is 113 grams instead of 100 grams. So I think I just lucked out with the yardage and everything. And the colorway is bay leaf, but I overdyed it, so my colorway is not the same as if you bought bay leaf from the store. Okay. Here we go. So this is from the Knitter's Book of Wool by Clara Parks. Corriedale. In the 1860s, the manager of the Corriedale estate at Otaga in the South Island of New Zealand began working on a new ideal dual-purpose breed. Like many shepherds before and since, James Little wanted to create a sheep that could deliver maximum value across 2 markets, a heavy and high-quality fleece for the fiber market, and when the time came, a sizable carcass for the meat market. He bred merino ewes with English Lincoln longwool rams and then inbred subsequent generations. Simultaneous breeding projects in New Zealand also included Leicester rams. The result of both projects is the Corriedale breed, named in 1902. Corriedales were brought to the United States in 1914 and have since become the second most numerous sheep breed in the world, after the merino. So they're quite widespread, and I've probably knit with their wool before just without knowing. She goes on to say that the fineness can be 25 to 31 microns. That is a very large range. I think for merino, she has it as like 19 to 23. So if you have the smaller micron count, then the wool is going to be significantly softer than the 31 micron count. And she has it as suitable for mid-range garments, outerwear, and rugged outerwear, depending on the fiber grade. So that's because of the varying levels of softness. And then I think this is pretty cool. She has pictures of the lock and the yarn. So while I was knitting with this yarn, and it does not include what percentage of which is which, it's a woolen spun yarn. It's a 2-ply woolen spun yarn. While I was knitting with it, it did not feel soft. It didn't feel itchy. It felt kind of spongy, I would say, and it just felt woolly. Like, it didn't feel pillowy the way that merino can feel, and so that's why I'm saying it didn't feel merino soft, but it also didn't feel like it wasn't making my skin crawl or anything, and I was knitting with it in the summer. So I was sure that I would be able to wear it as a scarf, but I was skeptical that I would be able to wear it for potential future sweaters, because, in case you're a new viewer, my arms are much more sensitive than my neck. So, but once I blocked this, and I gave it a very aggressive blocking with my blocking wires, I stretched them out as much as I could, it seems to have really softened. I want to say softened, but it's still, I mean, this isn't Malabrigo, worsted or anything. And I actually like that, because this feels like it's really going to live up to a lot of use, and I'll be able to throw it in my bag without worrying about it pilling. But yeah, it became a really delightful fabric. To be honest, even more delightful than I was expecting from the knitting of it. And after blocking, I was much more curious about what it would be as a sweater than I was while knitting with it. So if you are very sensitive to wool, then this is probably not going to work for you as next to the skin. But if you're just moderately sensitive, then definitely give it a try. As I said, it's $18 a skein, which is not a bad price for, domestic, that kind of stuff. Domestically created yarn. Manufactured, that's the word. And I love how it looks in lace. That 2-ply, just even before I blocked it, you could already see the lace pattern, but oh, it just opened up so beautifully. And it's got a lot of drape. I mean, merino is not known for its drape, so I think that's partly the fact that this scarf is knit on the bias, partly the fact that I blocked it, and then I think that's the Corriedale coming in with those long wool traits versus merino. So, I mean, you can see. So whether or not I use this for sweaters in the future, I think it is a wonderful, wonderful yarn for stoles because it's soft enough, it's not bothering me at all. It's sturdy enough that I'm sure it will wear well. And yeah, because it's woolen spun, it's really, really light feeling, even though it's very large. So I'm absolutely delighted with how this turned out. I love it. I've worn it multiple times. And I'm sure that I'll be wearing it more in the future. This is a good size for me for neckwear. I resisted how big I wanted neckwear in the past. But yeah, I think fingering, oh, and then the other thing I was going to say is I've been knitting neckwear out of lace weight yarn, and this is a fingering weight yarn. And I think in future I'll be opting more for fingering weight than lace weight. The lace weight ones feel just a little less substantial. And I suppose that would be fine for warmer weather or if I lived in a warmer climate, but by the time that I am ready to wear a scarf, I really want something that has at least a bit of, I don't know, substance to it. So yeah, I love this and would definitely highly recommend, whoops, that's the wrong side, the pattern, and I'm thinking about knitting another one for my sister. I might wear this home for Christmas and see if she wants one in a different yarn. So, finished object number 2 out of the way. I think I'll show you one more and then I will read to you from the book to give us all a break. Okay. I have the Third Time's the Charm mittens. And it really is the charm. I kind of was worried I was jinxing the project by naming them this before I was finished. And their name is because this is the 3rd project I've used this yarn in. Oh, I love them so much. I'm sorry, this is going to be the episode of me gushing over my finished objects. I mean, I pretty much always love my finished objects, but I'm not sure if it's because autumn has arrived or if I've just had a really good run of knitwear pattern yarn combinations, but I am just really thrilled with my knitting lately. Okay, so here are the mittens, and they're out of Quince & Company Lark, which is their worsted weight 100% wool yarn in Bird's Egg, which is this really lovely muted blue. They're so pretty. Okay, sorry. And I got this yarn for Christmas a few years ago, and I used it to knit up this really cool jacket pattern that basically was like a Victorian gentle riding jacket or something, but I don't know, like a frock coat. It wasn't that big, but it was swoopy, and it was a really neat jacket. But this yarn and pattern, they just didn't work quite well together, so I wasn't wearing it, and I decided that the yarn was too pretty to not be worn, so I ripped it out. And then I planned to do a button-up cardigan, and I was going to wear it kind of as a sweatshirt. And I picked this red and cream yarn to go with it, and it was going to be all fun and vintagey. And I pretty much finished knitting it, and then I realized that I wasn't going to wear that sweater either. Just not going to wear worsted weight sweaters. So this is the 3rd project. I actually had enough yarn left over from knitting the 2nd sweater that I didn't have to rip out any of the 2nd sweater in order to make these mittens, so that was nice because that means I didn't have to wait for the yarn to dry. So this yarn has only been knit twice, but the pattern includes matching leg warmers, and those I ripped out the sleeves of the sweater for. So the pattern is from Vintage Modern Knits, and it is the Innsbruck mittens and leg warmers. The book is full of patterns that are based on various folk knitting traditions, and this one is the Tyrolean tradition, which is a German region. And you do all these twisted stitches, and then you embroider them afterwards. So the embroidery colors, this really pretty silvery beige is Blacker Tamar Luster 4-ply in the Ottery colorway, which a friend sent me a little ball of. This gray is Blue Moon Fiber Arts Gaia Fingering Merino in deep unrelenting gray, which is left over from a sweater I knit this spring. And this teal is Knit Picks Wool the Andy Sport in Sapphire Heather, which another friend sent me. So lots of good memories with the embroidery. And originally I was actually using, whoops, almost lost the bonnet, this color for the teal, but it turned out it didn't show up at all. So contrast isn't as important when embroidering mittens as it is when doing stranded color work, which kind of surprised me, but I will know that in the future. So I'm really happy. I like some combinations that are more creative across the color wheel, but what I really love are these kind of tonal combinations, like the dark teal against the lighter blue, and this is a blue that tends towards blue-greens, and then the neutrals. And I feel like I'm trying to push myself out of that, but I'm not sure why. I mean, if I have a comfort zone and preferences, why do I need to be pushing myself out of that comfort zone? I don't know. Okay, so I did turn them into convertible mittens because those are way more useful for my life as a dog walker. And that was not in the pattern. I used the tutorial that I've been using for a couple years now that I just love the results. And I actually filmed, I have a link to that tutorial, which is pictures and words, but I filmed how I converted the second mitten. The lighting is not the best. The focus was also fussy because I accidentally left it on face focus, which is not useful when you're looking at mittens. But I couldn't re-record because I've converted them. So I will put that up on YouTube just in case it's useful to you, but just be aware in advance, it's not going to be the highest quality. Back to the pattern. I did make modifications. I slimmed down the cuff because I have small wrists, and I really don't like it when mittens bag. I knit it at a slightly tighter gauge because I have smaller hands than average. I made the thumb bigger though. The thumb was tiny. I mean, it calls for a gauge of 5 stitches to the inch, and they had you stopping the thumb gusset at 10 stitches. It's miniature. And all the patterns all the projects on the pattern page complained about the thumb. And I also switched the gusset increases to the outside of the thumb, which I did for the moth mitts as well, because I just strongly prefer the shape you get from there versus doing the increases here. I might have had a few fewer stitches on the palm. I can't really remember. It would be on my project page if I did. But yeah, so those were the main modifications that I made. And I cannot wait to have leg warmers as well because this turned out so pretty. I mean, the twisted stitches are pretty on their own. It took me a while to, actually it was funny, the twisted stitch knitting that I've done in the past, you're crossing cables every row. And this one, you're only crossing every other row. So it took me a while to remember that I had rest rows in between. But once I got used to that and could stop tinking back, then it went really smoothly. And it's a very predictable pattern. I would say that the chart is a good pattern for newbies. Maybe not the mitten pattern because of the fit issues, but the chart, because there's rest rows, and I mean, these are very predictable circles, and then that one. So you get into the rhythm of it quite easily. Yeah, so I love how these turned out. The book does not include very explicit directions for the embroidery. It gives you little tutorials for the different stitches, but one of the tutorials, well, pretty much all of them, like if I didn't already know how to do French knots or the lazy daisy stitch, I would have had to look it up on YouTube. And the stitch that I didn't know, which is the gray yarn stitch, I still have no clue what I was supposed to be doing. There's no chart for the embroidery. You just have to look at the pictures and match it up. And so you're kind of on your own as far as that goes, which did not impress me. And I have done very little embroidery in the past. I'm not a complete beginner, but I'm very close to it. And so I really wasn't sure what to do about the ends. And I came to a much better solution on the second mitten than the first mitten, which I'm going to show you the insides of, just so that you can be horrified. So, second mitten, much better, much neater. The first mitten, I cut the yarn for every French knot, and then I had to tie knots and try to weave in all those ends, and it was not good. So after that, for the second mitten, I wove up through the wrong side, so you can't see it from the front, but that really eliminated a lot of those ends. And instead of working kind of hopscotching around, I just followed the vertical lines of the pattern. And the other difference that I did was, so two of the yarns I held double and the other one I held single, but I was able to do it on all of them. I looped the yarn and then I pulled the end through that loop on the wrong side. So down here, instead of having a knot, there's just that loop. So that means that I only had to weave in the two ends when I got to the top, which was hugely helpful as far as those things go. So I definitely would suggest doing that if you are going to be doing a lot of embroidery. And then just prepare yourself for having more ends to weave in. I'm planning to do a cardigan with this style of knitting, so I'm really glad that I got some practice in with the mittens, and then I'll have some more practice with the leg warmers, which I plan to cast on very soon. I actually knit a leg warmer and then discovered that I put too much negative ease in it. It fit, and it was comfortable. Like there was still plenty of give in the fabric. However, I forgot that twisted stitches, they don't look good when they're really stretched. And so even though it was comfortable, the fabric looked as if I was like hulking out of the leg warmer. It was not good. So instead of third time is the charm for the leg warmers, it'll have to be fourth time is the charm. That poor yarn. But yeah, so really happy with how those turned out. I would recommend the pattern with those caveats. I would not recommend it to a complete beginner. I feel that way about that book in general. I tried to knit one of the fingerless mitts patterns when I was very new to color work and fingerless knitting in general, and it did not turn out well. This is a passage from The Painted Drum by Louise Erdrich, who is a contemporary U.S. novelist. She's written at least one nonfiction book that I really love too, but primarily novelist. And she is of the Ojibwe Nation, which is one of the Native American nations. And so her books always include Ojibwe characters as well as other characters. I would say that there's a touch of magical realism to her work. A lot of times they're historical. They tend to be set in the Dakota kind of area. And they're just really excellent. They're about emotions and people and relationships and how all of those work in a time when your culture is being actively destroyed, essentially. So how it's about the resilience of people in the face of genocide, but in a way that makes it about daily life as opposed to about big epic issues. I'm not sure if I'm describing this correctly. Her books are very thoughtful and literary, and so if you enjoy introspective writing, then with very memorable characters, a lot of times the main characters are women and girls, but when she writes men, it's just as good. And her books, even though they're about difficult times, I always finish them feeling uplifted and hopeful. I read one of her newest books, La Rose, right during the tumult of November of last year, and it was kind of a lifeline for me. So she's definitely one of my favorite authors, and I would recommend her to you if you enjoy beautiful writing with very unusual stories. The magical realism is not as extreme as like Gabriel Garcia Marquez or something like that, but it's just a touch that is really nice. It kind of makes her books feel more mythic. And She does. She has written a few that don't fit that mold. A lot of her books are set in the same place, which I think is really neat, the same imaginary place. But the vast majority of them, I would say, fall into that category. Okay, so The Painted Drum is narrated by several characters, but the one who's narrating right now, her job is basically she's an antiques dealer, and so she lives in, I think, Maine, definitely New England, rural New England, and so she works with estates of people who have passed on, and she's been called into this house, and the family, one of the ancestors was a U.S. Indian agent working over on this Ojibwe reservation. And she's going through the collection of things that he appropriated back then. Okay, so. And she has found a doll. As I unwrap the doll, the fugitive taste of smoke vanishes, and there is the doll herself, exquisite. The perfectly cured hide of her skin has somehow retained its softness, though from the faintly smudged darknesses on her arms and skirt I see she had been loved as a toy. Her red quill lips are stitched into a calm, amused smile, and her bead eyes are set at a lively angle. Her coarse black hair was plucked from a horse's mane, and each black thread sewn into her head and then divided into braids. Her dress is also made of tanned hide, decorated with bits of shell and the old antique beads called greasy yellow and ruby red whiteheart and German blue. Her waist is belted with a woven sash. Attached to it she wears a tiny scabbard that secures a tiny skinning knife. Her moccasins are sewn with flowers, and she wears jewelry. A ring of trade silver makes a bracelet on her arm. From her pierced fawnskin ears dangle miniature earbobs that are hawksbells so unusually small that they could hang from the throats of warblers. She carries a thimble-sized basket woven so cleverly that I laugh in pleasure. I bring the doll out at once and show her to Sarah. Oh, there she is. She takes the doll from me and handles her with familiar tenderness, smoothing the coarse hair down and caressing the slender horsehair eyebrows embroidered above the glittering brows. My uncles used to let me play with her if I was very good. Yeah, I really loved the amount of details that she included and the focus on the handiwork of the women who had made that doll. Back to finished objects. I'll show you the little one first because the next one is going to require a lot of talking. So this is from a Susan B. Anderson pattern, and I found this pattern on Ravelry, and I had to knit it just to see how it worked. So I knit it yesterday, and I'm very delighted with it. So ready? Woo! It's an egg that turns into a turtle. How wonderful is that? Oh my gosh. So as I said, I found this pattern on Ravelry. It's a free pattern called Egg to Turtle, appropriately enough. And you download it from the Interweave webpage. I was a little confused at first, but there is a link. And when I saw it, I was like, how does that work? I must knit this, because I knew that my niece would really enjoy it, and if she didn't enjoy it, my mom is a big fan of turtles. So I went ahead and knitted up out of scraps. And the knitting process itself is much simpler than I expected. You actually knit the two pieces separately, and then you sew them together. But so I was a little disappointed in that. I was expecting more knitting magic, but then once I had assembled it and could transform it between a turtle and an egg, the magic was all there. It was so fun. I had to FaceTime my mom and sister immediately to show them how it worked. But I made them promise not to tell my niece so that I can send it to her as an egg, and then she will be surprised. So this was just incredibly fun. The pattern was definitely a bit fiddly. I went ahead and crocheted the legs instead of knitting them because, once again, that seemed simpler. And the other modification I made was, for the shell, you're supposed to pick up the stitches around the body. After my third attempt to pick them up evenly, I decided to just knit the shell and sew it on. I think she was making it seamless because a lot of knitters prefer seamless knitting, but I prefer to just do things separately and sew them together. But yeah, so if you do it as written, there are no seams, if that's an advantage to you. And the other part that gave me difficulties is because the turtle is going to be stuffed inside the egg, I knew that I would have to knit at a very firm gauge for it to not show through. Usually I really don't mind if some stuffing shows through when I'm knitting softies. But for this I did a very firm gauge, and that was very difficult on my neck and shoulders. So I won't be knitting like a whole bunch of these, but I am so glad that I made one, and I really, really love it. So, I mainly use scraps, but the body of the turtle is knit out of Barrett yarn in Green Heather, the Aran weight, which a kind knitter sent me to play with kind of for dyeing, and it has sat in my stash since because it was already caked and I am lazy and did not want to, there we go, reskein it to dye. However, while I was working on this, I went ahead and reskeined another cake that she had sent me so that I could dye it orange so I can knit myself some pumpkins. So I will be using that shortly. I'm sorry it has taken me this long. And I think it's really great for softies. It's not like, it's a sturdy rustic kind of yarn, so it's not super soft and cuddly, but for things that are going to sit as opposed to like be hugged, it held its shape beautifully. Like there's no stuffing in that tail. It's very efficient. The shell I knit with the lighter green is Quince & Company Osprey, which is their Aran weight, in lichen, which was left over from a project. And I just had a tiny ball left over, and it used about half that ball. And then the dark green is yarn that Inez sent me. It's Portuguese yarn. I can't remember the brand, but I think it was hand-dyed. It's really cool. It's like a rustic single-ply heavyweight. So I thought it would be really lovely to put some of it into this little project. And I liked it so much that I used it to make the legs as well. And then the egg yarn is Cascade Elite Woodland, which is a nettle wool blend, and it's a sport weight DK yarn. There we go. And in just the cream, and it's left over from a sweater that I knit. So I held it double to get thicker. And you can see that even though I knit it really thickly and really snugly, there's still a couple points where it shows through, but mainly it's pretty firm. So I would highly recommend this pattern if you're in need of a little bit of delight and whimsy in your knitting and you don't have problems knitting yarn at a very firm gauge. My final finished object is a sweater that I knit for myself, and I've never knit a sweater this fast in my life, and I probably will never knit a sweater this fast again, but I'm really happy that I did, so I will go ahead and try it on. I'm calling it my Country Mouse cardigan because of the color. It is knit out of Elsa Wool Cormo, woolen spun fingering weight in the medium gray color, which the particular shade I have, she's discontinuing, and she's offering a different percentage of, so she'll still have a medium gray, but it'll be a slightly different percentage of dark yarn to cream yarn. And I used the Audrey and Unst pattern, sort of. And I am utterly in love with this sweater, and I plan to live in it. So I bought 3 skeins of this yarn to knit a sweater a few years ago, and I did knit that sweater, and I had a full skein of yarn left over. But the sweater I knit was a jumper. And these days, I wear a lot more cardigans than jumpers. And the Audrey and Unst pattern calls for 900 yards. It hasn't been blocked yet, in case you're wondering, because I've just been wearing it. I should block it. What was I saying? The Audrey and Unst pattern calls for, I think, 850 yards in the size I wanted to knit. And the leftover skein had 450 yards, because it's a 4-ounce skein. So I decided to go ahead and pull out the jumper, even though I enjoyed it and wore it a lot, because I knew I would wear the cardigan even more. And now that I have knit the cardigan, I feel like that was an excellent decision. So I'm glad that I made that decision, although it was a little sad because I'd worn that jumper quite a bit. It was one of the first sweaters I ever knit and designed, and I just had a lot of good feelings with it, but now I have a lot of good feelings with this new one. I will say that pulling out yarn of a sweater that you've worn a lot versus one that you haven't is definitely a trickier proposition. I already knew that I was going to just sacrifice some yarn around the arm area, the armpit area, both on the body and the sleeves of the old sweater, because that was the only place that looked really worn, as well as the cuffs. So I just didn't even bother unraveling the cuffs. And then the only other problem I had was I had done set-in seamed sleeves, and I got impatient, and I was unraveling at night. It's not a good combination. So I cut what I thought was the mattress stitch yarn and was actually the yarn on the sleeve cap. So then I lost a certain amount of yarn on the sleeve cap because I had cut that yarn. But that was just my own impatience. So I highly suggest, if you're going to unravel something that's seamed, so you're going to be taking it apart instead of just unraveling it, you do it with good light and when you're not in an impatient mood, and leave your scissors far away so that you're not tempted. It's much better if you just don't cut. So that means I've still got about 90 grams left, which is exciting because I love this yarn so much. Okay, so it's difficult to see. Woo. Okay, that's not going to work. I'm just going to insert the photo that I took for Instagram, although that one's not buttoned up, but here it is buttoned up. I decided to knit the 34.5 inch size because, as I said on my last podcast, I'm interested in a more blouson style fit and look. However, the Audrey and Unst pattern, the body of it is designed for a different body type than I have. So in the pattern, you knit the deep twisted ribbing, and then you start the stockinette and you do your waist shaping in the stockinette. But my waist is lower and I wanted the ribbing to sit at my waist. And I was trying to figure out, because even though I wanted the ribbing to sit at my waist is not, 4 inches long. So I was trying to figure out how to do that. And what I did was just switch needle sizes. So I decided the center 2 inches of that bottom band would be the 2 that would sit on my actual waist. So that's where I used the smaller needles, and for the inch at either side, I rotated between 2 needles. So I knit the body on a size 3. For the waist ribbing, I started on a size 4, then I dropped to a 2.5, and then a 1.5, which for metric, basically I dropped 0.5 millimeters each time. And that worked out really well, which you cannot see right now, but you will see in the picture. So here's what the bottom of it looks like. I used my favorite tubular cast on. I have the link to the tutorial in the project page, because it's really easy and it's really neat. So I made that modification, and then for the body, as soon as I switched to stockinette, I did a set of increases, and the specific details are on my project page. I typed them all up. And what I did in order to decide how many increases to do was I measured around the bottom of my rib cage, which is where that was going to fit, and then I added either an inch or half an inch. I cannot remember. And that guided me for the increases. So as you can see, it's kind of poofy, and I really like that. So I did that amount of increases, and then the increases that were left that I needed to get me to the bust measurement, I put both at the side and in the middle. And I did them fairly quickly. So by about here, I was up to my full bust measurement. And all this was me experimenting with how to make it more blouson-like. And I did the same thing in the back. There are increases both in here and on the side. So for that, I had just completely done my own thing. I didn't even really look at the pattern. And my gauge was slightly smaller. I was getting 6.2 stitches to the inch instead of 6 stitches to the inch. Sorry, I'm talking quickly because I'm going to meet some friends in the woods after I finish recording. And they've been texting that they're ready. So I apologize if I've become a speed talker. But and then the other thing I did differently than the pattern is I knit it in pieces, so it's seamed on the side, and that's because in my experience, if I want woolen spun yarn to stay snug at my waist, seams need to be involved. So once I got to the yoke, I followed the pattern directions. Even though my gate, I had like a couple more stitches to account for that gauge difference, but that was really easy to incorporate into the stockinette, and I just relaxed and did exactly what Gudrun Johnston told me to. It's really nice knitting a pattern that a lot of people have knit and loved, because then I can just follow her directions. So I did that for the front, and then the back is just all stockinette. And she has you bind off for the center of the back before doing the sides. And once again, I was trying to just follow all the directions, so that's what I did, even though usually I like the back of the neck to come up higher. But she does have these bits come up higher, so it's not like your sweater's going to move on you. And then I did the sleeves as the pattern says, where you pick up around the sleeve cap, you do short rows, and then you knit down. The pattern has you do 3/4 length sleeves, but I did full length sleeves, and with that same nice deep rib. So that's the only modification I made there, and I just continued her pattern of decreases until I was down to what I needed to and I could try it on. So I like how it fits. The sleeve cap is definitely wider than a set-in sleeve cap would be, and I don't like that quite as much. Like, I can see why people enjoy this. It was nice to not have to seam at the end. However, I really dislike knitting sleeves with a body attached, because every time you're like turning around, it's just really unwieldy. And I don't mind seaming. I actually kind of enjoy it. So I think I'll stick with my usual seamed set-in sleeves as opposed to doing short row set-in sleeves. But, you know, I'm glad that I tried it. I'm trying really hard now that I've been knitting for a few years to not get stuck in my ways and to not just decide that my way is the best before I've tried other ways. So I went into it with an open mind, and I definitely think that there are very appealing things about how it works. You didn't have to think about your sleeve cap. You just had to go back and forth with the short rows once you had picked up. So you didn't have to think about decreases or anything like that, or work out any calculations. So if you want a set-in sleeve sweater and you want to design it yourself, but you're not sure about how to do that math, I think this would be a really nice way to do it. As I said, it does make for a wider sleeve cap, but it still looks good on me. And remember, I'm knitting a size up compared to what the pattern suggests you do. The pattern suggests you go for 0 ease or 1 inch of negative ease, and one of the sizes was 32 inches, which would have been 1 inch of negative ease. My upper bust is 33 inches. My full bust is varying right now between 33 and 34. So I'm sure that if I had done the 32-inch size, it would be even snugger, but I wanted a slightly looser fit to this. So I can see myself using that technique in the future. I just don't think it will be my go-to, is what I'm saying, because at least with this sweater, because it's woolen spun, it was nice and lightweight. It wasn't like super draggy, but still. What else do I need to say? I'm sure this went really quickly for me because it was pretty much all stockinette. I was not in the mood to think about my knitting. I just wanted to read, but I wanted something to knit while I was reading, so that's what this sweater was. I did change the neckband. The pattern calls for I-cord, and I started doing that, but when I tried it on, I wanted this to be a really snuggly, cozy sweater, and it just felt like there wasn't enough snuggliness around my neck, so I switched it out for twisted 1x1 ribbing. And I also, the shoulder is a little wide. Once again, I think that's because of the size I chose to knit, so I wanted a neckband that would keep that shoulder up. When I wear it, that shoulder sits on my natural shoulder line. It's not slipping down to my arm, but if it moved any further, then it would be off my shoulder. So I wanted a neckband that would provide some extra structure, and I wanted it up the back of my neck. I didn't like having the back of the neck lower, so doing the ribbing was just a really easy way to fix that. I do think that the I-cord bind off in the as written looks beautiful with this yoke pattern, so that's why I tried to make the I-cord work, but just for what I want this sweater to function as, the 1x1 rib was a better choice. And the button band. So that's the other thing that I really wanted to talk about, other than what I did differently to make a more blouson style body, which I love and definitely want to pursue in the future. I'll talk about that before I get to the button band, just so that we're all cohesive. The one thing is, as I said, I hadn't thought about how knitting a slightly larger size with positive ease, because I've never knit a sweater with positive ease. The most I've done is 0 ease at the bust. Does result in slightly bigger shoulders. So when I design my own sweaters in this style, and I'm also designing the yoke as well as the body, I'm going to have to figure out a way, because I like the fitted shoulder look. So I'm just going to have to think about that a little. That's the one thing that I would change about this cardigan. And then the other thing is, I don't think I would do the bust shaping quite so quickly, because it does make for fabric that just kind of sits there. And that's fine. As I said, I love this sweater. I'm just saying that for future me, in future designs, I would perhaps just increase a little more slowly. But I'm definitely going to be doing increases right after the ribbing from now on. And I really like the slightly looser fit. I think there's a place for both, you know. I like having snug cardigans for some outfits and looser cardigans for others. So that was a really valuable lesson for me to learn, having never knit a sweater with positive ease before. And that is what I want to say about ease. So on to button bands, which is the other part of the topic that I promised you we would talk about again. Okay, we are all buttoned up, so I can tell you about the button band. This is my Sepia cardigan, which I designed myself and knit, I think I finished it last month. And when you last saw it on the podcast, it had a different button band that waved. I strongly dislike waving button bands. I don't notice when it's other people, but when it's my sweater on me, it's a giant pet peeve. And I never used to have a problem with waving button bands, and then all of a sudden it seemed like all my sweaters were having them. So I decided I ripped out the button band that I tried on this to begin with, which was dramatic in and of itself because it was this complicated button band, and so I thought it would be easier to cut off. Remember what I told you about scissors when unraveling sweaters? I'm never using scissors to unravel sweaters again. It is not easier. Instead, it's terrifying. Anyway, but I managed to get it off at the end. And what I did was I really looked at the sweaters that I had knit before that didn't have waving bands, and I basically went back to first principles. So I picked up many fewer stitches, because I think part of the problem with waving button bands is when they're longer than the body. So then there's these extra bits, right, between the buttons that wave. So I picked up a lot fewer stitches. I did a rib-based pattern, although this is a linen yarn, so it doesn't behave the same way that the wool ribbing does. So the other thing that I did for this that I didn't do for the wool is when I did the buttonholes, so I do a buttonhole where you yarn over and then you knit two together, or SSK, you just do a decrease, right? But for these buttonholes, I did 2 decreases, one on each side. And the buttonhole that I use, it's a Pam Allen buttonhole, and you can find a link on either of these project pages. It's a 3-row buttonhole. And so for all 3 rows where the buttonhole was being made, I kept that stitch count. So I didn't increase. Does that make sense? So there was 1 fewer stitch, because obviously the yarn over accounts for 1 decrease. And then once I had finished the buttonhole, then I increased that extra stitch that I decreased. So that means that, because buttonholes are open, right? Like, the buttons tend to stretch them out over time. So 1 fewer stitch for each buttonhole just makes sure that the band doesn't have as much room to stretch. And as I said, I don't think you need to do that for wool. I didn't do that for any of the wool cardigans with button bands that sit neatly, but for linen, I thought it was a good idea. And then the other thing I did was make sure that I did a pretty firm bind off so that the band isn't stretching at all. And I love how this button band looks. It makes me really happy. Oh, and the third thing that I did, all this is in the project page. I talked about it on Instagram when I did it. I just haven't talked about it here on the podcast. And this is something that usually, so I decided 2x2 ribbing is not good for button bands, because it's just trickier if you're doing a yarn over and knit 2 together decrease to have it look neat and to have it evenly spaced. So since I didn't want to do a 1x1 ribbing, I figured out how many buttonholes I wanted, and I figured out how many stitches I had picked up, And then I like developed a little algebraic formula to tell me what type of ribbing to knit so that each of the buttonholes could be nice and super neat and nicely spaced. But that's not something that I needed to do on the 1x1 rib. That's just the other thing that I did. I don't know if you can see, but there's very nicely evenly spaced buttonholes. Okay, so after that kind of return to first principles of how to make my button bands behave, I used all of that for this button band as well. And as I said, this hasn't been blocked yet, so once it's been blocked, it will sit nicely. But you saw when I put it on versus when it's sitting flat, it already sits really neatly. So I picked up at a rate of 2 for 3 stitches in the body, but only 1 for 2 on this waistband, because I noticed I was having more problems with sweaters waving at the waistband, and that makes sense because I knit the waistband on smaller needles, so my row gauge is more compact. So if I picked up at 2 for 3, I would have more stitches down here than I needed. So 2 for 3 here and 1 for 2 here, and this is something that's really going to vary depending on your stitch to row ratio. I happen to have very squat stitches, hobbit stitches, so that's why I pick up at 2 for 3 instead of 3 for 4, is because I have more rows for each inch of knitting than some other people would with the same 6 stitches per inch gauge. Hopefully that made sense. So I picked up, and then I did 1x1 ribbing because it's so easy to space buttons, and of course it went with the whole sweater, but seriously, 1x1. And I did twisted ribbing because that's what the sweater called for, and I just always like twisted stitch ribbing. And I'm one of those people where knitting through the back loop is just as easy for me as knitting through the front loop. I hold my needles very perpendicularly, so purling through the back loop, it took me a little bit more to get into the habit of, but I've done it so much at this point that I can do twisted 1x1 ribbing without looking while reading, without thinking about it as well, so I am lucky that way. If, like, you hate doing twisted ribbing, then it's not worth it, in my opinion. Sorry about that tangent. Back to button bands. And so I did the button side first, and I did a 1-inch band. The pattern calls for a 3/4 inch band, but I feel like, I don't know, I like at least 1 inch to have it be really solid and anchored. So I had taken that into account when I was figuring out how big to make the front sides. And then the actual button band only goes to here because I was thinking I would do an I-cord bind off. And 9 buttons seemed like enough for this. So then I figured out how to space them. Since I was doing it differently than the pattern, I had to figure that out myself. But if you don't like figuring that out, Amy Herzog has an app that I think is $5, and it will do the math for you. You just say how many buttonholes you need and how many stitches you have in your band, and it will tell you. So I don't mind doing that math. I think it's kind of fun. It's like a word problem. So, and then I did a tubular bind off, which is a much snugger bind off than the bind off I used on the sleeves, even though they look pretty much the same. So let's see. Oops, sorry, I shed a lot. Okay, so they both look pretty much very similar, and they both look a lot like the tubular cast on, right? However, this is the invisible sewn 1x1 rib bind off. I have a link to the YouTube tutorial, and it is very stretchy. I use it for socks a lot, and for sleeves it seemed nice, and I did it for the neckband as well. This is the tubular bind off, which you make in the same manner that you make a tubular cast on, but it turns out much less stretchy, and that's what I wanted for a button band, so that's what I went ahead and did. And yeah, so that method worked really well. Then when I decided I was going to do a tall neckband, I went ahead and added another buttonhole because it would have looked odd otherwise. And I suppose that is the sequel to my concerns and curiosities about button bands and fit that I've been sharing with you over the summer. I'm so happy about this cardigan. I can't wait to wear it, and it'll look even better when it's blocked. One more thing, and then I will let you go. I wanted to show you, so the body was knit entirely in the skein of yarn that I hadn't used before, and the sleeve is entirely reclaimed yarn. They both look pretty good, huh? This yarn is very durable. And the best thing about it being very durable is that it's also really soft. Cormo is a merino, it's its own breed, but it has a lot of merino in it, so it's one of the fine wools. It's incredibly soft and squishy and velvety. I would rather wear a Cormo sweater than cashmere. I've thrifted a couple cashmere sweaters. So the fact that it holds up that well, I am super, super impressed. I have knit one sweater out of 100% merino yarn, and it started pilling after like the second wear. This does not, so. I definitely plan to knit more Elsa Wool Cormo sweaters in future. The cost ranges from $20 to $25 for a 4-ounce skein of fingering, which is 450 yards. As I said, this sweater took me less than 2 skeins. So for me, that is very affordable for a luxury sweater. I mean, it's not like super cheap or anything, but hopefully, you know what I mean. And she only sells it in natural colors. So I'm actually thinking about kettle dyeing a sweater's quantity. I'm like afraid that I'm going to destroy the Cormo with Kool-Aid. So maybe we'll try that with some of the leftover yarn. But I think that over dyeing one of the darker natural shades would be pretty incredible. So. But I have a sweater's quantity of this in a very light gray color to knit up first before I go about purchasing any more yarn. But I can't recommend that yarn enough. I've done a yarn review on it. It's one of the very favorite yarns I've ever tried. I plan to live in this sweater, and it's like the perfect cardigan for me, obviously. I did have a bit of fussing about the buttons. I wanted shell buttons, and they were a bit too bright and shiny for the sweater, but I was determined, so I sewed them on anyway, and then they just didn't look good. So I cut them back off, and I used these buttons, which is what everyone on Instagram told me to use anyway. And I thought I would mention, whoops, I picked up some prickers when I wore it in the woods. I used 2 different colors of embroidery floss to sew them on so that I could kind of, because the buttons get lighter towards the center, and so I thought it would be fun to kind of play into that ombre effect with the embroidery floss, which is my favorite way to sew on buttons. That is the entire episode. I do not plan to have nearly that many finished objects in 2 weeks. But it was very fun talking with you. Hopefully you enjoyed all of those details. And, oh, sorry. I should leave things alone. I'm about to call Thistle over. As I predicted, Moth has been napping on her electric blanket this entire time. But here is Thistle. We're going to head off to the woods. It's been so wonderful spending time with you. Thank you so much for watching. And I almost forgot, but I always include show notes in the box below. Those include links to all of the project pages, which is where I put the details of techniques I used and measurements and that kind of stuff, and any modifications. And I also include the names of books that I've read from, yarn that I've reviewed, needles that I've reviewed, all of that. It's down below for your reference. So if you check all of those sources and I miss something, feel free to ask me. But hopefully I have put something where you can find the answers instead of waiting for me to answer your question personally. I always forget to mention those, so I think some people don't know that they're there, but they are. And I love hearing from you. I am the charm of it on Instagram and Ravelry, as well as here on YouTube. YouTube comments and Instagram are the easiest ways for me to get in touch, but I do reply to Ravelry messages eventually. And I cannot wait to see you again. Bye!